Bible Alive, the four quests for the Jesus of History, presentation to a new quest. What a second question. During the 1988 United States presidential campaign, 1,000 points of light, Republican candidate George Herbert Walker Bush informed the League of United Latin Citizens in convention that, if elected president, he would appoint an Hispanic to his cabinet. Here are three reports of that announcement. The audience applauded Bush's promise, the Washington Post. The audience gave the vice president only scattered applause, Associated Press Dispatch of the Baltimore Sun. The vice president's promise drew a standing ovation from the several thousand gathered conventioneers. The New York Times. Huh? This is from modern times, folks. Our times. So which was it? Say you were not present at the 1988 convention. How would you determine which of these three reports from three different respectable newspapers best describe the event?
The media always reports the truth.
Right, exactly. Well, were they all true? We're talking about factual. United States people, Americans, take great pride at being able to arrive at the factual truth. You know, God's honest truth. But the fact is that we are bombarded with interpretation on a regular and routine basis. The Bible, too, is not a video recording a la news, live at 5. The Bible is, in fact, a library of interpretations, which itself requires further interpretation. Today, we focus on interpretation. You may have heard it said, in the beginning was the Word. How many of you heard that? In the beginning was the Word? Yeah, don't believe that. In the beginning was the interpretation. You know, many years ago, back in Rome of the 5th century, the Pope was urged by his advisors to banish the Jewish merchants from Rome. It was unseemly, they said, that these people should be living unmolested in the very center of Christendom. After all, for them, they thought that was virtuous back in the 5th century. An edict of eviction was drawn up and promulgated, much to the dismay of the Jews, who knew that wherever else they went, they could only expect worse treatment than was meted out to them in Rome. So they pleaded with the Pope to reconsider the edict. The Pope, a fair-minded man, offered them a sporting proposition. Let the Jews appoint someone to debate with him in pantomime. No words can be uttered. Only hand gestures would be allowed. If their spokesman won, the Jews get to stay. But if not, oh well, it must be the will of God. In the beginning was the interpretation. So the merchant Shlomo was chosen to debate the Pope. Wise choice, considering how Shlomo, Solomon, is associated with wisdom. When the great day arrived, the Pope sat on a throne in St. Peter's Square, facing a large crowd of bishops, priests, and faithful. Presently, the little, humble Jewish delegation arrived in their black robes and flowing beards, with Shlomo standing in their midst. The Pope turned to face the little merchant, and the debate began. No words can be used, only hand gestures. The Pope solemnly raised one finger and traced it across the heavens like this. And then he swept his arms, pointing in all directions. The merchant, Shlomo, promptly pointed with emphasis toward the ground, like this. And then with a glare, hit his chest with his hand and nodded. The Pope seemed somewhat taken aback. Even more solemnly, the Pope raised 3 fingers and kept them firmly right before Shlomo's face. The Jewish merchant thereupon lifted one finger and held it just as firmly before the Pope's face. The Holy Father seemed astonished by this response. Then the Pope thrust his hand into his robes and pulled out a piece of flat bread and a chalice. Thereupon, the merchant, Shlomo, thrust his hand into his paper bag and pulled out an apple and took a big bite. At this, the Pope explained in a loud voice, "Enough! The Jewish representative has won the debate. The edict of eviction is hereby revoked." People were confused. There was a clot. Couldn't believe it. What had happened? The bishops and priests clustered around the Pope in astonishment 30 minutes later. "What happened, Your Holiness?" the bishops asked. "It was impossible for us to follow the rapid thrust and parry of this debate." Weary, the Pope wiped sweat from his forehead and said, "That man Shlomo is brilliant. He's a brilliant theologian and a master of debate." "What happened?" the bishops asked. And the Pope explained, "I began by sweeping my hands across the sky and pointed at all our surroundings to indicate that the whole universe belongs to God. What I was saying was, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and everything." But that clever Shlomo, man, well, he thrust his finger downward and hit his chest to remind me that the greatest of all these creatures, these created things, is man. What to do? I then raised my hand and put 3 fingers right before Shlomo's face to signify that there are 3 persons in the Most Holy Trinity. Imagine my shock when Shlomo raised 1 finger and put it in my face to indicate, yeah, that's true, but God is still one. Knowing that it was impossible to get the better of this theological genius, I finally shifted the debate to another area, says the Pope. So I pulled out a cup and a loaf, indicating to Shlomo that this is the bread and the wine that becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our salvation. But then he instantly and masterfully produced an apple to remind me about how, nonetheless, we are still wounded by original sin. So there's nothing else I could do but concede victory to the man. Okay, well, that's how it was with the Pope and his friends. By now, the Jews had arrived at their synagogue in the ghetto. "What happened?" they asked Shlomo in bewilderment. "Ah, I don't want to hear anymore. Will you relax? You're going to have a stroke." "What happened? What went on?" Shlomo was indignant. "It was all rubbish," he said. "What do you mean? Explain it to me. What happened?" Look, finally the merchant explained. "Look, first the Pope, he moves his hands around, pointing everywhere like he's saying, 'I'm the Pope of these here people.' So I pointed downwards and hit my chest to make it clear, 'Yeah, well, I'm Shlomo the merchant.'" So next, this Pope guy, he gestures to me with his 3 fingers threateningly. Right in my face he puts him, saying, "Look, I'm giving you to the count of 3 to clear you and your Jews out of this town." So I put my 1 finger right in his face and say, "Yeah, well, I don't care if it's 1 second, we ain't leaving." And what happened then, asked Shlomo's friends. Then came Shlomo. Well, he took out his lunch, so I took out mine. I don't know why he threw the debate. I think you get the point. In the beginning was the Word. For us, for everybody, in the beginning was the interpretation. The same set of symbols are multivalent. They can mean lots of different things to lots of different people, given different perspectives. You all see that? One and the same set of symbols can have at least 2 different meanings. The Middle Eastern Mediterranean library called the Bible, together with the 4 canonical Gospels, is full of symbols, ladies and gentlemen. It has multiple meanings. Some interpret the Gospels differently, though. Some think that the Gospels are well-researched, fact-precise 21st century Western biographies. They aren't. And at least among here, the Catholics in here, our Catholic Church tradition does not insist that we believe that, despite what you may have heard from individual catechists and preachers and priests. Listen to what I'm saying. And programs. WTN. To grasp this, I want you to consider the synoptic gospel we call Luke. Let's take a moment to look at Luke. Here's the prologue of the gospel called Luke, and I want you to follow it along here. Here's how it begins, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. Y'all see that? It's very clear. Right there in the first 4 verses, we have stage 1 of gospel development, stage 2 of gospel development, and Luke is where? Stage 3. He's not an eyewitness, and he's admitting it. Again, remember, official church teaching. The Gospels can only be understood developmentally. They emerge through a 3-stage process. Stage 1, the original words and deeds of Jesus. Stage 2, after his resurrection, Jesus is now interpreted as, theologically, Messiah and cosmic Lord, soon to inaugurate theocracy. Stage 3, the writings themselves of people who lived after them. That's what's meant by stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Remember this from the last presentation. Stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. When you read the Gospels, folks, you have to understand you're getting all 3 at the same time. When you go to a talk in the Archdiocese of Miami or other places, you ever get told stuff like this? Or do you just get something quoted to you as if it's, the news? 20th century facts, 21st century facts. I want you to see this. This is our tradition, folks. And it's right there in Luke. Luke has a literary history. It's not like a Western 21st century biography, this history of Luke. It cannot even be called an ancient biography. It's something different. It's a gospel. A theological portrait of Jesus. It evolved from multiple stages of time. Look where Luke is compared to where Jesus is. The material he uses, how many hands has it gone through? Time sequence. From the vantage of the Gospels as literary compositions, we can say that they have 3 levels or 3 stages. And when we read them with more or less precision, what we're doing is peeling back the layers. If you're really reading them with more or less precision. If you're not, what you're doing is you're reading into them things that your brain is trying to fill the gaps of your understanding with. Provided by what? Your culture and mine. And you're distorting the text. Can God talk to you through such distortion? Sure, he talks to us through everything. But if you're going to read them that way, may I suggest to you reading instead Captain America, Spider-Man, or the X-Men, because you're going to get a heck of a lot closer to your culture from those documents than you are for these ancient Middle Eastern documents. Can God use X-Men? Sure he can. Can God use Spider-Man? Absolutely he can. With great power comes great responsibility. Let's use our great power, Americans, Spider-Men and women. From the vantage of the historical process, by which a written gospel was composed, we can see that these levels have stages of gospel development or formation. The section in yellow is level 2. The section in blue is level 1. That's the first people that knew Jesus. Just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, that would be red. Stage 3. I too have decided, the us that got it handed down to me. About 50 to 60 years lie between the Jesus movement in the late 20s and the composition of Luke. Stage 2 of gospel development. That's what that 60-year period represents. When Luke is being written, it's stage 3, the red. The author of Luke wrote between 80 and 90 Common Era, or AD. Stage 1 would be Jesus' career in the late 20s, perhaps even the year 29 Common Era. Dry season. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3. When you're reading the Gospels. That's what you should be looking for. It's difficult, though, to determine exactly what's Stage 1, what's Stage 2, and what's Stage 3. The Gospels are texts which evolved, ladies and gentlemen. Inspiration cannot mean dictation. Big C Catholics ought to thank God that our teaching church does not insist on us believing that it does. When we look at the 4 written texts we call Gospels, together with the other 23 documents that make up our New Testament library, we see that these writings were composed and some of them continued to be edited at different times and at different places and for different reasons throughout the first century. And therefore in them, we see different theological perspectives being explained and illustrated by different authors in this library. And so what we can see when we look at our New Testament is 4 waves represented by these tiers. And as the situation changes for the Jesus group or Jesus movement, both in space and time, and circumstances and crises develop, that changes the kind of writings you get. It changes the focus of these groups, and you can discern all 4 of these waves preserved in our 27 New Testament documents. If we say we believe in inspiration, inspiration must be a messy, messy business. I do believe in inspiration. I try to be a good Catholic and good Christian. And therefore I believe God inspires this, but I don't mean by that God coerces this, God dictates it. He must work, she must work in the mess. Consider the theological perspective that Luke adopted in his telling of the story of Jesus 50 to 60 years after his career. Luke was definitely interested in Jesus' teachings and doings. This theological perspective is certainly different than Paul's, who was writing in the 50s. Paul's 7 authentic letters are the earliest of all Jesus group writings. In fact, as church, the earliest literature any of us have is 1 Thessalonians. Could not have been written before 48 Common Era. That's 18 years after the death and proclaimed resurrection of Jesus. Writing around 50 Common Era, some 20 years after the death of Jesus and his resurrection, Paul has no interest whatsoever in the story of the pre-paschal Jesus teachings and doings. He's not interested in Jesus' teachings. Can you imagine that? But by the time we get to the 80s, Jesus groups are interested in those teachings. United States people and Westerners in general are obsessed with facts. We tend to think that truth equals facts, that facts and truths are synonymous. But that is not true. While all facts are true, not all truths are facts. Hey, thanks for watching. Just continue the playlist for the next part of the study. If you have further questions, this is good. They will get addressed, so keep watching. If you found value, please subscribe, like, and share. As always, Questions, comments, and criticisms are most welcome. God bless you.